Here we go. So what does Deeda stand for? Deeda is Dynamic End-to-End Data Aggregation. And now you need to kind of have a quick background of the story before we start. So the story begins in Boston. And this is where I did my undergraduate and graduate work. And as you can see, it's a pretty interesting city. I'm sure a lot of you guys have either have friends that are there, or maybe some of you have studied there. That's the statue of John Harvard and an MIT prank where basically they dressed him up to look like Master Chief from Halo 3. And at the time, I was interested in the brain. And I was doing research in... Actually, let me see if I can... Oh, I can't move this. All right. So, I was interested in studying how the brain processes information and all the amazingly wonderful things that we can do naturally. And looking at the artificial world, you know, I was always fascinated by how we do things through computers and all the technology, but it never seems to quite, you know, compare to what we do. And one day, and I was looking for something to actually focus my work on. And, you know, because the field itself is so vast. And I was walking through the Boston Common, and I smelled this flower. And it reminded me of a very specific memory from when I was like 5 years old. And I was like, wow, this is incredible. How is it that our minds do this? How is it that we get to this, we have this ability to take all these seemingly disconnected things from our senses, and we store them away, and 25 years later, you just, you know, stumble across a smell, and there it is, like that. And, you know, and I started looking into it a little more. These are called Proustian memories, and after Marcel Proust, a French writer, who wrote this book called In Search of Lost Time, and it's in 7 volumes that was released from 1913 to 1927. And he talked a lot about his characters having these sensations of smell that reminded him of things from his past, and interesting things like that. But oddly, while I'm supposed to be doing this work in the neuroscience area, I started thinking of something totally different, which is all the stuff that we have on the web. So when we think of things that we have stored in our minds, whether they're pictures or those, you know, video memories of those things that you're almost recalling that have all those different senses in it, here we are on the web, and we've got, you know, pictures and videos, and Yelp sort of I'm using to represent taste, even though it's not quite accurate. But there's restaurants and things in there, right, that you might have favorited because of something you really enjoyed. And podcasts for sound and audio related stuff, and Facebook for people. The point is, here we have all these things, and they're all isolated. There is no connection between them, really. There is no way that I can just see a picture and automatically be brought to a video that, you know, is related to it or reminds me of it. I can sort of search around and do different things, but you know, I wanted to sort of figure that out and see if there's a way to make that a little more interesting. And then I went back to the brain, because, you know, that's sort of the thing you always come back to when you're doing your research. And one of the things that caught me was that 3/4 of the human brain is dedicated to visual processing. What that means is that it's simply a very complex task of being able to navigate around in your surroundings and do a lot of other things that we take for granted that are happening right now while we're even listening to this talk and looking around at each other and writing things or doing anything that we're doing. So I told myself that while, you know, part of the solution really has to do with interfaces, and if I'm going to create something, it's not just something that should reside on the web and is a web technology, but I need to be able to understand a more visual interface, because that likely will make it a lot easier for this you know, process to be managed and interacted with. So I was sitting in my apartment, and I was staring at this thing, right? And I was like, this is actually incredible. This is actually incredible for a simple reason, because Microsoft and all these companies, no one can make anything that competes with this device. And it's this little wheel. And how is it that you can't make something cooler than this little wheel? Is this really it? And so this is sort of like, you know, where I had this moment where I said, well, all right, I actually think I can figure out a way to make something better. And I contacted all these companies individually once I started working on all the parts and things that I needed to do. And Alps makes all the tact switches, in case you guys are wondering. Every phone that you guys have in here, probably 80% of the buttons and switches in it comes from Alps. Toshiba for storage. And Wolfson Micro, these guys were there with the original iPods back in the day for integrated circuits and all kinds of other cool things. You know, you need a graphics processor, and Freescale had some really cool stuff at that time. I got to working on this, and you know, in the meantime, the Boston Globe came by and they said, hey, you know, we want to see some of the stuff that you're working on, and, you know, did a little story. So here I am, and this is now 2005. And I'm working on this interesting capacitive touch layer, which sits over in my demo, and what I was working on, these breadboards and dev boards, was an OLED screen. Because I thought, you know, really if you're going to go after Apple, what you need is something that's even better than a normal screen. Maybe we can, and Sony had just released a CLE or something that was using a 3.8-inch OLED. So I was just curious to see for a demo, I want to make something really cool. And so there's me working with one of those things. We got a little lag here, so all right, let's see. And here's another thing, and if you'll notice up there, I finally named the project that I was working on Apple Juice. And so, you know, you're gunning for number one there, and here's some other pictures I took of the industrial design specs and some other stuff I'm working on. Here's me really happy. I've got this little thing working here, and I can do some cool stuff with touch on the screen, and here's what it ended up being. And this probably looks really familiar to you guys, right? And now I've got all these breadboards and dev boards, and all the demo stuff worked, and the industrial design worked out, and I figured, you know, I've got this device, and I actually want to go in and manufacture it. And that's a little crazy for somebody who's, you know, doing their grad school thing and thinking they're going to do a startup, and their first entrepreneurial thing is going to be making an actual device and hardware, right? But, you know, and at that time when I finished everything, I ended up moving back to Chicago. And I didn't come out to the Valley. This is because I was born in Chicago, and I said, you know what? Everyone runs out to Silicon Valley. And I'm going to make something happen in Chicago. I'm not going to go out there just because, you know, everyone feels like it's a must to do that. And my family also was there, you know, so I figured I've been away for grads for so long, might as well, you know, be a little closer to my family and try and show them some of this crazy stuff that I've been doing. Because this is also another weird thing when you're away and you're doing stuff like this. It's almost like the Manhattan Project, right? So you don't want to tell anyone about it, and you're constantly working on something and you're building stuff, and you know, your parents just want to know, like, well, so what exactly are you doing, right? And you're like, well, trust me, this is really cool. And it's going to change everything, and people are going to see this, and they're going to be like, wow, that was the answer to how you beat the iPod, right? So I roll into Chicago, and these are some of the things I heard from the VCs and investors that were there, right? And there's some pretty funny things, because you know, the YouTubes and Facebooks with an S at the end on purpose, because literally I think there was a huge disconnect on, they just seen some valuations for YouTube and a lot of other things going around mid-2006. And they were just assuming, well, you know, this is kind of interesting, but there's got to be something else that maybe you've worked on or you're doing on the website that we can just, like, you know, the traditional, like, flip and sell kind of thing, right? And then, meanwhile, Toshiba asked this really simple question. And this is the guy who's in charge of business development, who had been basically funding, giving us all our hard drive specs and dev stuff to work with and hack on. And he goes, where's your iTunes? To which I said, what? You know, I'm making a hardware thing, and this is hard enough, and you want me to actually make a music store, and how's that even possible? And so I thought about it, though, for a second. I said, you know, what's the deal with iTunes anyway, right? And I realized that it's not about content and selling music, right? Remember all that stuff in the beginning when it was your social network stuff and your Flickr and your videos and all these things that are sort of interconnected in your life. That's the important content. That's the important value that you know, this software should be doing to help manage this device. I can't sell music. I'm not going to make deals with BMG and Sony and all these other guys, right? But what I can do is I can actually make it really simple for your device to be able to handle all this cool other stuff that you have. And that's the starting point. And I think that would be something that would actually be really cool for a device to start off with, right?